economic mobility from one generation to the next. That is, if Black Americans experience the same rates of generational mobility as their white counterparts, the speed of racial economic convergence would be more than twice the observed rate we see and have experienced from 1870 to 2010. In other words, racial disparities in income have declined at less than half the speed that would have been expected over the past 150 years if there weren't such a large racial difference in generational mobility, even controlling for the parents' original starting point. And this holds for the Reconstruction and Jim Crow eras, as well as the recent decades. This is drawn from recent work by Bob Margo, economist Bob Margo, and Pat Baer. And so what this means is that for the past 150 years, for generation after generation, the economic success of Black Americans have consistently severely lagged those of white Americans who began their lives in otherwise comparable economic circumstances. And so you may want to reflect here on what drives that slow speed of racial economic convergence. Well, I'm emphasizing it's not just racial discrimination in schooling and job and the labor market and professions and lending and housing and policing and criminal justice. That's all true. But in addition, it's the segregation of opportunity. The persistently high levels of segregation in schools and neighborhoods are influencing the structure of opportunity for kids and thereby thwarting upward mobility prospects for Black children in particular. That Black and white families who are identical in almost every way in terms of household income routinely reside in neighborhoods that look nothing alike in terms of the available resources. So when we talk about integration, I don't just mean the assignment of children to schools, but we're fundamentally talking about per pupil spending, teacher quality, access to AP courses. We're talking about curricular quality, teacher diversity. Those are all the pieces that what integration means when it's applied. I want to highlight that the differences in parental wealth and the racial disparities in wealth are a big part of why affluent Black households, those with incomes above 75,000, live in neighborhoods with a higher average poverty rate than poor white households, that is those with income below 40,000. This has been shown in related work by Pat Baer and Sean Reardon et al. Okay. Now, what I want to highlight is when you look at this period of the Black-white academic achievement gap, this period where we saw the greatest racial convergence in economic outcomes, in health outcomes, in academic achievement, again, is the period of cohorts that overlapped exposure to integration. We see the kind of major slowing down of that convergence since cohorts born after 1985. And so what I just want to highlight is when we think about the connections of racial stigma and structural racism, you have to understand it from a life course perspective, that the ways in which racial stigma leads to neighborhood segregation, that feeds and fuels school persistent segregation and access to opportunity, educational resources, and then that leads to differences in college readiness and in degree attainment. And those pieces are part of what democratized access to the labor market. And those pieces then spill over to criminal justice interactions and that, again, racial stigma around who's profiled, et cetera. And all of those pieces collectively impact the generational mobility process that leads to long-term economic standing and social status that then recycles its way through into the next generation. So what we're talking about here is these mechanisms for the slow glacial pace of progress is the housing discrimination, the racial wealth disparities, the racial differences in homeownership. Those are mechanisms, but it's really what we have to kind of understand is how these pieces lead to cascading effects across the life course. Disparities in academic achievement lead to disparities in access to higher education and labor market disparities, discrimination in criminal justice, disparities in economic status. And so we have to think about where is it that we intervene. Now, Brown v. Board and the subsequent movement for integration is what I'm going to be highlighting in part, just so that you can see that when we've had concerted, intentional efforts to disrupt the systems that reproduce racial inequality, that we've seen progress. Okay. Now, the Fair Housing Act, of the late 60s from the Civil Rights Movement. Integration, school funding reforms, both pre-K expansions and access, and school funding reforms that didn't rely solely on the property tax base to fund local schools. That when we've done those things, again, redesigning Section 8 housing so that concentrated poverty is not the essential reality for low income, particularly Black households. Affirmative action, enforcement of anti-discrimination laws, the job training programs, right? Sentencing reform, minimum wage laws, and kind of greater enforcement of pay discrimination, and a more robust safety net. These are all pieces that have to be connected in a system-based approach. Now, what I'm just describing first is that there's an argument that school desegregation was a failed social experiment, or that school spending doesn't matter, or that pre-K is ineffective on long-term outcomes, and it's simply not borne out by the facts. Where we failed is discontinuing those efforts to integrate our schools, to invest in them equitably, and to begin in the pre-K years. So I'm just going to try to bring us back to where some of the movement began on the eve of the Brown v. Board. Now you can see, oftentimes people think of this as a Southern phenomenon, but actually we see there is a strong regional variation in terms of legal segregation prohibited, de jure, de facto. We can see that in the South throughout legal segregation was required. But what we also understand is that the timing of actual integration efforts, that nothing happened after the first decade after Brown, that when we look at the map of when integration efforts really kicked off, that the first decade after Brown, there was little actual integration that occurred. And then we see with the 64 Civil Rights Act and putting teeth in enforcement, we see Jackson 1963 versus Pasadena. We see the Crawford 1976 case where they were grappling with how, and affirmed that de jure school segregation and racially motivated school boundary gerrymandering was unconstitutional. And so it wasn't just in the South that these aggressive ways to resist integration were happening, but it was happening in California as well. And so what we show is by using the full universe of the timing of that set of integration efforts, we see that when the court orders were enforced, that we see a dramatic decrease in racial school segregation. And that led to significant increases of leveling up school resources to the level white students were previously getting, where we see children from the same districts after enforcement of school desegregation court orders, that we see about a 20% increase in per pupil spending among Black students being experienced relative to cohorts from those same schools that were previously confined to all racially segregated schools. So the dual system, what we then do is document how, when we follow those kids, these are cohorts born between 1950 and 1970. And what we see is among those cohorts that experienced integration, that with each year of exposure, that Black children achieved much greater educational attainment, to the point where by the late 80s, the rates of college attendance rates for 18 and 19-year-olds, the Black-white difference, the rate at which Black children were attending college had actually risen to comparable rates as in many places as white students. What we also see is that that increase in educational attainment and educational quality was mirrored in significant improvements in adult earnings. That we see about a 1 to 3% increase in earnings with each additional year of exposure, that translated into about a 30% increase in adult earnings relative to prior cohorts that had been relegated to segregated schools from those same districts. And that led to a significant reduction in the annual incidence of poverty. That significantly led to about a 20 percentage point decline in the annual likelihood of poverty being experienced in adulthood compared to Black children from those same districts prior to integration going into effect. And we don't see that these impacts led to significant reductions in attainment for white children. Now, this was connected not only to school integration, but hospital integration, desegregation that preceded it. That in the South, access to hospitals had been significantly prevented. And basically, when we look at places, this is drawn from Ken Shays et al.'s work, to show the decline in post neonatal mortality rates, particularly in Mississippi and Alabama. And we see that that led to significant improvements in infant health, that then also led to significant improvements in educational and cognitive outcomes. So, what I'm just trying to highlight here is that these changes, that segregation creates fertile conditions to act as a contagion, to accelerate the spread of infection of racism, and no U.S. institution has gone untouched. But what we have done is cease our efforts to integrate our schools. The inequalities baked into the system, the schools, the housing, the school funding, the public pre-K, the safety net, health policies, it's all connected. And so what we need in the policy debate is a systematic approach to segregation and discrimination that ties education to housing, pre-K and health, and other policy areas. And so in the contemporary policy influences on school segregation, the reason why we are currently at levels of segregation today that prevailed in the early to mid 90s, in the early to mid 70s, that is, we've resegregated, we reached peak integration levels in the late 80s, 1988 to be exact. And in each year since, we have begun to revert back to now the same levels that prevailed in the early 70s. And part of that is school closings and unregulated charter school growth and gerrymandered school district boundaries and a kind of federal hands-off policy around integration. We see racialized tracking, right, where the AP course and college preparatory course access is very different. Even a third of our public high schools that have a large Hispanic and Black enrollment, a third of them do not offer calculus, which is one of the gateway courses to STEM fields and being able to major in engineering and in some of those STEM majors in college. We see housing policies around zoning policies, as Stephen was mentioning, the provision of government services in terms of how we design our housing subsidies and in our housing programs that often confine lower income families to concentrated poverty neighborhoods. And then the real estate practices and mortgage lending discrimination that is coupled with it. And this is all layered onto the legacy of the restrictive covenants, the segregated housing projects. Now, when Stephen was describing the restrictive covenants, I grew up in the Minneapolis metropolitan area. And when my parents first bought their first home in a small suburb right outside of Minneapolis, they had still on the title deed the restrictive covenants that said this house is not to be sold to Negroes or Jews. And they saved that just for the safekeeping of recognizing this history in a generational sense is not far away, but its consequences are still being felt today. When we look at desegregated schools, the cosmetic appearance of them, we have to think about whether they're functioning in integrated fashion. That too often, even when we see what looks like diverse schools, that there's segregated classrooms within what otherwise ostensibly may look like diverse schools. So we have to think about how are we tracking students and having high expectations beginning in the early years so that there's not that kind of segregation. Now, what I want to highlight briefly, because I know I'm kind of running short on time, what I want to just highlight briefly is that what Pat Bayer, for example, has been able to document, as well as Sean Reardon, is that a significant part of this part of parental wealth differences, that when we look at the average neighborhood resourced environment that dictates access to school resources, et cetera, that the typical affluent Black household is in a less advantaged neighborhood in terms of resources than low-income white neighborhoods. Low-income white households. So if you look at Black and white households with the same parental income, that oftentimes the typical Black household while having that same income is in a much less resourced school environment. And what that means is that these prevailing high levels of segregation, they undermine equal educational opportunity. They're the single biggest driver of racial differences in upward mobility prospects for children. They make the nation less productive and competitive, and they weaken our economy. And so, what we want to really do is think about how we can restructure these pieces. That while segregation, residential segregation patterns are by race and class are often viewed as the harmless byproduct of personal choices, or like simply the result of market forces, the causes and consequences of segregation are a direct byproduct of policy choices. Segregation has long been policy engineered. And so what we have to recognize is desegregation to integration means moving from access to inclusion. It's moving from exposure to understanding. And really, this is the way forward. And we have to recognize that um, putting billions of dollars into racially segregated and unequal structures can be counterproductive and can just be a recipe for inefficiency, not innovation. Housing and credit markets, education and schools, transportation and job creation schemes like opportunity zones, we need to think about creating opportunity in ways that recognize how segregation and its forces can undermine um, the true realization of equal opportunity for kids. And for every $100 of wealth held by white families, the average black households hold up only $5. A quarter of black families have no or negative net worth, compared with less than 10% of white families. And too often, the study of inequality is ahistorical and falls victim to the policy amnesia about the long run conditions that produce the current realities, the current disparities. Racial wealth disparities are not primarily driven by differences in individuals' savings behaviors, but instead are a legacy of segregative and discriminatory housing policies. This point is best highlighted by the fact that the typical Black American with a college degree has less wealth than the average non college educated white American. The consequences of the concentration of wealth and affluence on the one hand, and the concentration of poverty on the other, that profoundly impact children's access to opportunity, may imperil our collective future. Too often, we have opportunity rich communities where children thrive in well funded, highly resourced schools that are geographically close, but socioeconomically worlds apart from the concentrated poverty schools within the same metropolitan area. It's become far too common to find a school to prison pipeline near a school to life success one in a neighboring district. These patterns begin early in children's lives, but our policy responses to them have occurred very late. So I want to stop here. I want to emphasize that I've tried to highlight the ways in which differential access to school quality and neighbor conditions explain the lion's share of racial differences in rates of upper mobility across children from low income families. And we need policy responses that focus on the educational opportunity of children that are not dictated by zip code, race, skin color, and poverty. Thank you so much for your time, and I look forward to the question and answer with the task force, as well as other questions that may arise. There's many more things to say, but I want to thank you for your time.
Thank you so much, Dr. Johnson, for that expert testimony. We are 9 minutes ahead of schedule, so at this time, we will take it to the task force for comments and questions, but I do want to recognize Dr. Menidian. You had 2 slides left that you weren't able to get to. So if you want to, pull up those last 2 slides, you're more than willing to do that at this time. We see the screen, but I can't hear you, so. And we see your screen, you're still sharing it, and you are also typing to us in the chat right now. Can anyone else hear Dr. Menidian?
I can't, but maybe while he's getting technically situated, maybe could we just take some questions from the task force, and then we can probably fold in Stephen's remarks in response to that. I think that will be a effective use of the time.
Yes, absolutely. Can we get a staff member to assist Dr. Menidian, particularly because he is still sharing his screen? Okay, thank you. So at this time, we would like to take questions from task force members. Would any task force member like to direct a question to any of our panelists at this time? Also, the BlueJeans app does not allow me to see every single person at one time. Okay, I see member Reggie Jones Sawyer, your hand is raised. You are recognized.
Okay, and this is probably for the whole panel, but for Dr. Johnson in particular. I've been reading some data on the effects and impacts on class environment, which, what type of school you have, how, what resources they have, they can provide to the students, chemistry labs and things of that nature, versus class instructor, how well that class instructor, how well they are and proficient at what they do, and then class size is reducing. And there was a study done in Tennessee where they provided the most optimal resources in that from preschool all the way until they graduated. Then after that, this was done in the 80s, they took that data and they compared what their salaries outcomes, which was increased. They looked at whether or not they had home ownership. Those individuals that participated in the study had home ownership was way up. And then they looked at their 401ks and whether or not they had in retirement. It was way up. And what it reminded me of, when I first was elected in 2012, every private prison came into my office and told me that they needed 10,000 more prison beds in 10 years. And I said, that's interesting. What algorithm did you use? And they said, we can estimate 100% that we need 10,000 more prison beds by the number of third graders that can't read at third grade level. That was astounding to me. And I said, well, I have an interesting proposition. Why don't we educate those individuals so we can figure out how many more college seats we need to build? Well, those private prisons never came back to my office. And I realized then the school of prison pipeline can be closed if we have an effective education system. And so I'm using the premise of the class environment, what type of school you have and how clean it is, how the educational opportunities are great, the instructor, whether or not they're motivated, they really want to teach the kids, and then we reduce the class sizes. If we did something like that, what could that be a start to impacting, ensuring that we have a better outcome with our students?
Well, I think that argument is the central focal point of my book, Children of the Dream, that we look particularly at the three policy prescriptions done in concert of school integration, school funding reform that ensures equitable school resources for all children, and then expansions of pre-K access. The Tennessee Star experiment that you're mentioning, that
Yes.
was a designed to be reducing the early elementary school grades, class sizes significantly, led to significant improvements in student learning, with the impacts biggest for low income and Black children. And they saw lasting effects. What I'm saying is my work on the policies outside of Tennessee, but with a nationally representative kind of portrait, very much mirror those impacts, that school resources matter, and that we have prior policy approaches that have often taken a kind of quarantine style approach to social problems, to distance socioeconomically advantaged groups so that the challenges of under-resourced schools can be confined to high poverty and minority neighborhoods, as if what affects some doesn't ultimately affect us all. So what I'm saying is that you can't know what you just described. The studies and the research that we do can't know those outcomes if we're not able to follow kids from birth to adulthood and link them generationally, and then look at what school environments they had access to during their school age years, and look at the full trajectory of outcomes, not just test scores, not just high school graduation
Right.
rates. I'm talking college completion, college going rates. I'm talking about whether or not they have been incarcerated. I'm talking about health outcomes, earnings. And so we're able to do that and provide longitudinal data and studies that are following kids over a 40, 50-year period, linked to their parents' backgrounds, linked to the school environments, in much the same way that you described the Tennessee Star experiment, but where we're using the policy changes that happened in some states and some districts at different times in the lives of kids, and showing how holding constant or keeping the family background the same, can we intervene to change the third grader that was below standards in their achievement in third grade, but change their trajectory through higher quality teachers, better school environment. And we see that their fortunes can be significantly altered in a positive direction or reinforced in a direction that you speak in the negative direction. And so the question is, what are the costs of inaction? And I'm putting forth that it's not just a moral imperative that we invest in our schools equitably in this way, but it is actually a argument that our economy's future depends on. There are a lot of lost Einstein when we don't invest and believe in the full potential of all our kids. And I'm specifically talking about Black children. Now, I'll also say, my fellow panelist who's a current freshman at Morehouse, I'm a Morehouse alum, so I have a particular affinity toward Morehouse and Black educators and the power of being exposed to a Black community that can empower. So I'm not suggesting that integration means that we don't rely on our Black community for that kind of lift. But what I'm saying is the resources that Black communities need require policy and connection. And that's not just for Black kids, but white kids benefit from that exposure to diversity too. Now, I'll be quiet, but I just wanted to at least try to respond. Hopefully that met what the spirit of what you were bringing with your thoughtful comment, Reggie, or Mr. Jones Sawyer.
Reggie's good. Thank you.
By the way, Mr. Smith, we're going to have a little separate conversation after this so we can connect.
You
Forgive
can
me,
have a
Madam
third
Chair.
one. White House grad too. So
Can you hear me? Okay.
Vice Chair Brown is recognized, and then we'll return to you, Dr. Menidian. Thank you. Vice Chair Brown?
is he muted?
Madam Chair,
Yes, Vice Chair Brown, you're recognized.
yes. I don't know whether or not this technology is working against me because we have too many Morehouse men on the Zoom. I want to say that our presentations have been excellent. One thing that concerns me is that after we get the economic base, after we get into the schools, after we get the fair housing laws, there is no monitoring and accountability. no monitoring and accountability to make sure that persons who just don't have the political or the moral will to do right are held accountable. So that I would hope that we would all understand, as Drinkwater said, knowledge we ask not, but help us to have the will of steel to do the right thing. And even if we get this reparation measure through, conceptually, politically, there's a major, major thing of making sure that it's actualized and concretely we get action. The final thing I want to point up is that we didn't say that much about gentrification, what that has done to the psychic, the culture, and the presence of black folk, so that they would not be conspicuously absent and treated as invisible people. Other ethnic groups still have their visibility. They still have their watering holes and their bays. So we got to make sure that we approach, in my estimation, this thing in a fashion that at the end of the day, we get what was taken away from us, yes, our dignity, our economic power, education, all those good things. But we got to make sure that we still, too, as human beings, reserve the right to be who we are, and at the same time reach out to others and work as a dream team to make this nation what it claims to be, one nation under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Thank you, Vice Chair Brown, for bringing those issues to our attention and for that offering. Now we would like to turn to Dr. Menidian for your last two slides, if you want to show them at this time.
Thank you so much for bearing with me, the task force and the chair. This is a little bit legalistic, so bear with me further as I try and present this, but this was something that the folks at the DOJ specifically asked me to address. So the terms de jure and de facto refer to, de jure means by law, and de facto just means natural or market-based, individual private actors. And the reason this comes up is in the context of racial residential segregation or school segregation, because the type of segregation it is, whether it's de jure or de facto, under prevailing Supreme Court jurisprudence, constitutional jurisprudence, determines the nature of the remedy. So if segregation is de jure, then it means that the government, whether it's local government, state government, federal government, has large leeway to remedy it. And if it's de facto, if it's just because of individual choices, as Rucker talked about, then the courts are much more circumspect about what government can do to remedy it. So unfortunately, because of the courts, the question of whether something is de jure or de facto seems to really have outsized significance. Richard Rothstein, in his book, The Color of Law, argues that American racial residential segregation writ large is de jure, not de facto. And the reason he says that is because even when something looks like it's just about market forces, there has been a significant government role. So let me give you an example that he provided to me. He's a good friend of mine that I wanted to convey to the task force. So he says, consider the Levittowns, the I think 7 or 9 developments in Pennsylvania and Long Island during the post-war period that sort of epitomized suburban development. He says, of course, William Levitt was a bigot. Left to his own devices, he would have refused to sell a home to an African American. And some of the comments we heard this morning related to that in LA and elsewhere. But he wasn't left to his own devices. He built the project with FHA and VA guarantees for his bank loans. If the FHA and VA obeyed their constitutional obligations, they would have said to Levitt, yes, we'll guarantee your loans, provided you sell your homes in a non-discriminatory fashion. That they didn't do that makes the financing of Levittown unconstitutional, i.e. de jure. That Levitt was a bigot was true, but irrelevant. And so the point here is that some people might look at Levitt's developments and say, that's de facto segregation. But what Richard is saying is that because the government financed, subsidized, and underwrote these developments, and then further mandated through federal regulation that they prohibit that it was discriminatory and not non-discriminatory, that there's significant state involvement. Let me give you another example that he didn't provide. So the Berkeley City Council in January 1963 adopted what was then called an open housing ordinance, what today we would call a fair housing ordinance. So this is the city council adopting that for the city. Well, in remarkably swift fashion, opponents of that ordinance got onto the April ballot a ballot initiative to overturn that ordinance. And in April, they succeeded. There's a video you can find online called Assignment 4 Segregation Western Style that describes that campaign. So literally 4 months later, people of Berkeley got a ballot initiative on the city, on the ballot, and overturned that ordinance. Is that, how would that be de facto or de jure? They're using the levers of government power, right, to prohibit non-discrimination. So why does all this matter? Why does it matter if it's de jure or de facto? It's not just that the Supreme Court has interpreted the Constitution this way, but also the 14th Amendment, which is the second Reconstruction Amendment. Section 1 has 2 sentences. The first sentence guarantees citizenship, overturning Dred Scott. The second sentence has clauses relating to equal protection, due process, and privileges and immunities. The second sentence provides those protections against states. Therefore, the courts over 150 years have built in this state action requirement. Now, scholars like Eric Foner and others have said it's greatly overstated, and that there's Section 5 of the 14th Amendment enables Congress to pass legislation, as John Powell talked about in earlier testimony, under the 14th Amendment. But the courts have narrowly interpreted the second sentence of Section 1 because of the state action requirement. Now, my specific position, I have a slightly different position than my friend Richard, which is that I actually find the distinction between de jure and de facto to be largely untenable. And the reason is because government policy and private market actors are so inextricably linked. So for example, I talked about the 1900 to 1930 era where local government was influenced by private actors, by homeowners, building in and these restrictive covenants. Neighborhood associations promoted them. Local governments promulgated them, asking developers to adopt them. I just think it's a totally untenable distinction. I think going back, it's a legal fiction that we've developed. And so Justice Kennedy sort of represents this. And by the way, this extends almost all law. He says the distinction between government and private action can be amorphous, both as a historical matter and as a matter of present-day finding of fact. Laws arise from culture and vice versa. Neither can assign to the other all responsibility for persisting injustice. I concur. So that's the point I wanted to make. Thank you for allowing me to make that sort of esoteric point, but I know your folks thought that was important.
Absolutely, thank you. It was very important. At this time, I would like to turn it to task force members so that we can proceed with our questions and answer period. Are there any task force members who would like to direct a question to our esteemed panelists at this time? Again, you can either raise your hand, make your voice heard through the voice option, or you can utilize the chat option so that I can see your inquiry there. Did I see a hand?
I think
Yeah.
Senator Brad has his hand up. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm having technical difficulty. I apologize.
Mr. Bradford, or Senator Bradford, you're recognized.
Thank you. I just wanted to piggyback on what Vice Chair stated as the impacts of gentrification, which is real. And I think we can all identify prominent African American communities that have existed for the last 50 years that are no longer the case. But I also want to thank the two presenters as they highlighted zoning implications, because zoning laws replace restrictive covenants.
Senator, we can't hear you.
Oh, Mr. Bradford, we cannot hear you. Senator.
And single family. Yes. Can you hear me? I keeps breaking up. That's why I parked.
Okay, can you just
So
restart just after what you said about gentrification, how zoning replaced restrictive covenants?
yeah, zoning replaced single family zoning replaced restrictive covenants as a way to prevent Black folks from moving in neighborhoods because they assumed as we migrated from the South, we would be looking for apartments versus single family homes. And those zoning laws existed, and we just passed legislation here in California, SB 9, that allows us to revert back to that. But there was a lot of pushback by African Americans who didn't know the history and thought this is going to change the complexity of their neighborhoods. And in fact, it will allow more home ownership and more residential affordable housing for people of color. So just want to bring that to the attention, folks.
Thank you, Senator Bradford. Would another task force member like to ask a question at this time? Member Holder?
Yeah, I do have a question. I'm afraid I'm about to be cut off because I'm losing power, but I'll give it a try. And if I get cut off, I'll dial back in. I have a question for Dr. Johnson. And I want to just thank all of you for your incredible contributions to what we're trying to do here. And your comments are very powerful and useful for this process. So, Dr. Johnson, I very much appreciated your perspective. I wanted to also, I know that you focused on structure, on making structural changes to increase access to educational opportunity. I also wanted to have you comment on the content of the curriculum and what changes need to be made to curriculum content to increase inclusiveness of curriculum, to increase representation in terms of education and critical thinking, and to move away from Eurocentric content to content that centers the experience of the experience and the contribution of people of color throughout history. What impact do you think that would have in tandem with the infrastructure changes that you talked about in terms of increasing opportunity for all in the education system? Can't hear you.
Thank you. Thank you for that great point, Ms. Holder. I think that the point of what integration looks like is that Black families shouldn't have to choose between a school that has more resources, but where they have to fear that the teacher won't believe in their child's potential, or that they have to be concerned about implicit bias from the point of educators in more integrated spaces. Meaning, what we're really trying to say is a multicultural curriculum is required, that diversity is here to stay. So, when we're talking about what are the ingredients to prepare kids for the diverse world that they inhabit, it means that they have to be exposed to not Black people as the subjects of slavery, but rather the amazing contributions of Black inventors, the innovation, in other words, our best parts are not defined by how we have been treated, but the curricular aspects talk about King, but not the way King challenged a lot of the ideas around the structure. So I think when I'm talking about structural racism, I'm talking about things that aren't about the interpersonal experiences of discrimination, but rather the structures that are still in place that allow, even when explicit bias and explicit racism is addressed, that still leaves the lingering effects of what structural racism in terms of access to opportunity, which is the laws, the practices. So when you're talking about curricular quality and multicultural curricular quality, and you're really speaking to teacher diversity and the lack of sufficient numbers of Black educators in our classroom, these are all pieces that are central to advance opportunity and what we mean by school quality and what we mean by socio-emotional development and developing leaders that get and learn across difference. So I think what we're really trying to say is that's actually the architecture of that, the vision for that is something that many parents are desiring. And I think this is an opportunity for a multiracial coalition to bring that to pass. And I think your task force can accelerate the movement that is now where people are recognizing that. Now, I think with any major, bold, progressive reforms, I think you have to prepare in advance for the backlash. And so the question is, we've seen the backlash at every period of major progress. The question is, are we going to do something in a way that anticipates that? Because the hoarding of opportunity is always in search of new tools. As Dr. Amos said, I believe it was Dr. Amos said, we replace restrictive covenants with, some form of, zoning laws and policy. So the question is, what are the contemporary ways in which the hoarding of opportunity is using new instruments that we would have to then circumvent in a policy-oriented way to ensure equal opportunity in curricular access, in teacher quality, in teacher salaries, because that's a lot of what money buys. You can't have Common Core standards and say, we're going to have these high standards for college readiness that include all of these dimensions you're saying, but have really high teacher turnover in schools, have most Black children taught by novice teachers and inexperienced teachers in the areas in which they're credentialed. It doesn't succeed that way. So I think these are all pieces that we want to bring to bear on the question. So thank you for that.
Thank you. So quick timekeeping, we have 10 minutes left. I did want to pose a question to Mr. Smith and to Mr. Jackson. For Mr. Smith, my question relates to what you brought up in your testimony earlier about freedom schools. So just for the record, if you could expand on what freedom schools are, and then also if you can, expand on what you were also hinting about reparations, what that could look like for Black students in the school and university context. And also, you don't have to answer this last question, but I'm curious, the reasoning for choosing Morehouse over a UC or Cal State, and you can only feel free to answer that if it informs the discussion at all. If it was just a personal choice, that it's fine. I was just curious about that. And for Mr. Jackson, I had a question for you. You can answer after Mr. Smith. For the record, can you expand on your experience as an LA County Youth Commissioner, the work that you're doing in that role? And then also you said that you were able to get your high school diploma from an innovative program after your experience at Crenshaw High. And so I'm curious to know if those programs that you participated in, is there, a school to, after you get your diploma or GED or whatever it is there a track to assist you all in getting into college or other institutions of higher education? So Mr. Smith, you can go ahead.
So I'm kind of all three are gonna kind of intertwine. And so the reason why I chose an HBCU is because I found my safe haven. I felt supported. I had my support system there. I did not see that. As much as I wanted to go to Berkeley, as much as I wanted to go to UCLA, I did not see that. Initially, I was kind of kept out because of the SAT. And then if I was to go, I have friends who now go and who have gone on to Berkeley and gone on to UCLA, and they don't have the support. Here at Morehouse, I do have the support. If I went to Howard, I would have had the support. If I went to any other HBCU, I would have had the necessary support, the cultural support. Everything would have been, I would have been at home. I would have been able to been educated, but also still maintain my social life as well. UCLA, I wouldn't have been able to do that. Cal State, yes, I would have been able to do that. However, I just didn't feel like I wanted, well, the programs that I wanted in sociology, I wanted to go to UCLA or Berkeley for specifically, but Morehouse was my best option. You had a question in regards to Freedom Schools. Freedom Schools started way back in the day where Black folks, during the civil rights movement, and it probably predates this, honestly. Well, the model at least predates the civil rights movement, but it's where currently we have Chosen Defense Fund, has Freedom Schools, which is a six-week long program during the summer, where folks go, we read books, K through 12th grade. We read books, we have folks come in and speak to us and read books. We have a whole bunch of, I think someone raised their hand.
I think Vice Chair Brown, he might have raised as a time thing, but
okay.
Oh wait, Vice Chair Brown, did you want to say something? You're on mute.
Excuse me, I couldn't resist not raising my hand because my fellow Morehouse man is part of a movement that evolved out of the summer of 1964, when Julian Bond, Marion Wright Edelman, Bob Moses, and others in the Mississippi Delta, where blacks terrorized and even murdered because they wanted to vote. And Reverend George Washington Lee was the first martyr of that era. On May the 7th, 1955, was on his way home, and members of the Ku Klux Klan shot his jaw off. He died before he could get to the hospital. He was president of the Belzoni branch of the NAACP. It was in that culture, it was in that hotbed in the Mississippi Delta where Marion and Julian and others picked up and said, we're going to continue to fight for the right to vote. But these white people are so racist that they've asked blacks such crazy questions as how many bubbles are there in a bar of soap, or how many windows are in the courthouse to qualify to vote. And out of that summer, where they discovered that many of the blacks did not really know how to read or write, Marion Wright Edelman and Julian and others said, well, we're going to teach our people. And the Freedom Schools were established. But after the movement of that 1964 period was over, Marion said, we need to look at these urban communities where black children are too far behind because of a lack of opportunity for quality education in these urban schools. And out of that passion, out of that concern and that vision, Freedom Schools continued. And I'm proud to say that Third Baptist Church of San Francisco now for 17 years has been involved in this Freedom School movement to make sure that we establish a means of making it anyhow. If the racists won't do right, if they don't have the will, and if we don't have the political clout to get them to do right by our children, we're going to learn anyhow. And that's what one man named John Barry Meacham did in 1827 in St. Louis, Missouri. What happened when St. Louis said no blacks could read? If they're caught reading, they're caught writing, they'll be beaten. What did the carpenter, John Barry Meacham, do? He, as a carpenter, built a steamboat and said, I'm going to put a steamboat on the Mississippi River, and he opened up a library and a school and floated over to Illinois, around the Free States. And they learned anyhow. And his first student was John Turner, who was the founder of Lincoln University, the oldest higher education black institution in the state of Missouri. So it got me excited to start talking about what we've done in spite of what's been thrown at us.
Yes,
We
sir.
still have the will and the passion to say we ain't gonna let nobody turn us around or stop
And
us
just,
from
and
excelling.
just 2-3 sentences. Ms. Edelman and I spoke heavily about Freedom Schools and the creation of it, and she basically said that it's something that it's a model, it's a teaching model, or pedagogy that you in curriculum that you can take and apply to any situation. It doesn't have to be within the confines of a school, but it's just a model that is very culturally responsive. And so I think for me, that's something that when I think of liberation, that's what it looks like to me. And so that's where you're politically engaged and politically informed. That's something that's near and dear to me. Second thing that you asked was
Just
what is reparations?
yes, what is reparations?
Yeah, what does reparation looks like in the collegiate sector? It's simply making sure that Black students have the resources that are necessary for them to succeed and for them to be in this space and, like I said, already succeed. And so having access to mental health, having access to dental, having access to eye care, having insurance, having scholarship opportunities, finances not being an issue when we get here, and making sure that professors also are culturally responsive and understanding. And so I think that's what reparations look like.
Thank you, Mr. Smith. And now, LA County Youth Commissioner, Mr. Jackson. If you need me to reiterate the question, feel free, but if not, go ahead.
You ain't gotta be so formal. Thank you though. Let's call it. Yeah, so the school that I went to was called Free LA High School. It's held within Youth Justice Coalition, where I also work at as a youth organizer and the youth outreach coordinator. It's an alternative high school. You can also get your GED there too. We have virtual classes and we have on-campus classes too. We're held within our old courthouse building that we took over in 2017, and we forced to close down in like 2012. And yeah, and we renovated it, and we do a whole lot of events there to let the community know about us. We give back food to the homeless, things like that. And there's legal clinics, and there's Second Call. Other organizations also host it, and there's that high school. So yeah. And then I also was gonna say
College. The question is, do they assist folks in the alternative higher education program? I mean, in the alternative high school program, do they assist with college matriculation?
Oh, I mean, yeah, they do. But what you call it? Because it depends. Because we had a college coordinator. So right now we're just balancing, like we're just getting our college coordinators right now. Bring them back in. But yeah, we usually most 9 times out of 10, most of our students do be able to go to college. We help them apply for that too. For like community college, I was gonna go to college, but I kind of, I had to worry about other things. I had to worry about work, making money, helping my mama with the rent. But what you call? Oh yeah, so I was gonna be like, so the Youth Commission, it was established in 2020 by the Los Angeles County Board of Supervisors. The Youth Commission is the official youth advisory board to the county. We are a youth-led organization that promotes youth participation in county affairs and policy development. Our members have experience in the foster care, juvenile justice, and homeless system. Can y'all hear me? All right.
So we're running out of time. So continue your thoughts, and then in your thoughts, by summarizing what reparations will look like for you and people similarly situated as you, those who have gone through the school to prison pipeline track.
All right. What you call it? Well, the commission also provides a forum for youth perspective, empowering commissioners to impact the system that are intended to serve and support them, their families, their communities. What you call it? We can be able to make recommendations to the board, county departments regarding policies, agency budgets, programs, and practices that impact children, youth, families, and their communities. Proposed to the board and county department new policies, programs, and services that would positively impact children, youth, families, and the communities. Annually identify at least 3 focus areas for concentrated review, analysis, and where appropriate commission involvement, and propose new legislations, advocate and provide recommendations to the board consistent with board policies regarding existing and proposed legislation impacting children, youth, families, and their communities. We represent 10 million youth behalf of LA County, and what I feel like appropriate reparations are, like for us, is everything that that Smith had mentioned before, and I had mentioned in my speech, and I feel like we're owed like a big debt of money. I can't put a amount on it, but when I searched it up, it was like 12 trillion. I feel like that's the smallest amount of where it can be started at. So yeah, that's it.
Thank you so much, Commissioner Jackson and Mr. Smith, for answering those questions. I would just like to color the rationale quickly for why I asked the question about whether those alternative high school programs are offering college matriculation is this, because at one point at UCLA in the 1960s, there was a program called the UCLA High Potential Program, where they recruited leaders in the South Central community, like Bunchy Carter and John Huggins, who were once Black Panthers, leaders of the Black Panther Los Angeles chapter. They recruited people like that to fulfill ethnic studies types of classes. And then upon successful matriculation from those ethnic studies programs, they were able to gain admission to UCLA. And so that program was actually taken away in 1969 when Bunchy Carter and John Huggins were assassinated on UCLA's campus at Campbell Hall, January 17th, 1969. But there has been conversations about what would it look like to bring something like that back in order to honor folks like, Commissioner Jackson, who have obviously shown high potential in the event that they would like to, attend colleges and universities like UCLA and Berkeley. So that was the rationale behind my question. Okay, great. Yes. Thank you again to all of our panelists, Dr. Rucker Johnson, Dr. Stephen Benedian, Mr. Jackson, and Mr. Smith. On behalf of the task force and the members of the public, we learned so much from your expert and personal testimony, and we look forward to engaging with you all further as this process develops. At this time, we would like to go to agenda item number 5, which is our lunch period. Again, sorry for going over a bit, 5 minutes. We will convene at 1 p.m. Where we will begin our second panel for the day on environmental racism, which will run for an hour from 1 to 2. So task force members, please be back onto the Blue Jeans platform no later than 12:50-ish, and we will have a hard begin time at 1 o'clock. Thank you very much.
Thank you for your time. Appreciate the opportunity.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Mr. Johnson, can I please get your contact information?
Yeah, let's see. Okay, I'm going to tell you orally. My first name is Rucker J, so RUCKERJ, at Berkeley, BERKELEY.edu. So send me a message now, and I'm going to send you back my cell phone, and then we'll figure out a time to do Zoom where we can connect. But I got good people there. I got people colleagues of mine that are on the faculty there, so I definitely want to connect. And I'm
Definitely.
just giving you my cell phone. Well, I feel like we're in a public space, but just
Yeah, it's
if you
recorded.
email me, then I'll give you the rest of the stuff.
Okay. Good to see
Okay.
Cindy Bradford too. All right.
Good to see you, Steve.
You too, and I love your poster.
Hello?
Hi, Dr. Brown. We will
Good.
get started around 1. So I know that it's recording, so just be mindful of that. The recording button is on.
Oh,
Welcome to the panelists who joined us so far. We'll get started at 1.
Chair Moore,
Thank
can you
you.
okay.
hear me? Chair Moore, can you hear me?
Yes, Dr. Grills, I can hear
Yeah,
you. I can.
I've been on all morning, but for some reason Blue Jeans is not cooperating with my video. And I had put in the chat that I had questions, but I don't know if you ever saw that from this morning's panel.
No,
And
I'm sorry.
yeah, so
It,
in any event, I'm gonna
it's
try.
been in and out. It's been in and out with me too.
I absolutely hate this platform, but nonetheless,
Yes.
Me too.
Excuse me, board members, we are broadcasting live out to the public still.
okay. But I am having tremendous difficulty with Blue Jeans. I do have to just say it's not the most user friendly, or it's not the most useful platform for me. So I'm going to try to join because I tried everything that everyone said. I've logged in, logged out like 4 or 5 times, done my camera on and off, and I just freeze every time it comes on. So I'm going to log off and try to log on my laptop instead of my desktop and see if that makes a difference. But if you don't see me on the video, I am here. So if someone could keep track of the chat, so if I have questions, I can get in, that would be really appreciated.
Yes, thank you for that, Dr. Grills, and I'll make sure to do my due diligence to ensure that doesn't happen again. I also sent you a message via text. I know you said you're going to try to log on through your laptop, but I sent a link for the Blue Jeans in case that works. I sent the same link to Dr. Brown this morning, so hopefully that works.
Okay, thank you.
Oh, Dr. Grills, as what happened last time, did you want to still answer your questions just so they can be on record and maybe the panelists can follow up later? I know that's not the most ideal thing, but I wanted to offer that.
Chair Moore, it looks like Dr. Grills dropped off. Oh, here she just came back on.
I'm trying to get video, so I'm going to log back off. That link that you sent, Chair Moore, does not work. It's not fixing the problem.
Okay.
Oh, this is so frustrating.
Okay. Okay, it's 1 o'clock, so we will get back to convening the formal session of the Reparations Task Force hearing. I will now call on Ms. Johnson, who will then call on Ms. Belton to cue a roll call vote, establish a quorum. Ms. Johnson?
Yes, thank you. Ms. Belton, would you please call the roll and establish whether or not we have a continuing quorum? Thank you.
Thank you, Chair Moore and Parliamentarian Johnson. We will now go down the list and ask that the task force members indicate their presence. Chairman Moore?
Present.
Vice Chair Dr. Brown,
Present.
Senator Stephen Bradford, Dr. Cheryl Grills,
Present.
Lisa Holder, Assemblymember Reginald Jones Sawyer, Dr. Javon Scott Lewis,
Present.
Don Tamaki,
Here.
Councilmember Monica Montgomery Stepp.
Here.
Thank you, Chair Moore. There are 9 members of the task force and 6 members are present, with 5 members required for quorum. A quorum has been reestablished.
Thank you. Now that a quorum has been established, we will now turn to our second panel of the day on environmental racism. I would like to remind each witness that their testimony is recorded, live streamed, and will be available to the public. I also like to remind all presenters, if you are not speaking, to mute your mic so that there isn't any feedback when our panelists give their presentations and testimony.